Good morning, everybody. My name is Nathan Darris with the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. We're going to get started here at about 10:35, so in about 5 minutes. Give everybody a chance to get signed in and take care of any of the inevitable little bugs that will pop up. In the meantime, I am going to put up a quick poll here to get a little bit more information about the folks that are here. So if you don't mind answering that while we're waiting for everybody to jump in. Just remember, if you've been with us before, great, but here's some housekeeping. We will take questions throughout the day. If you have questions, go ahead and just put those into the questions box. We will get to them probably at the end of the webinar. Sometimes we may catch them and handle them as they come in if it's particularly topical to where we are in the presentation. But we will get to those questions definitely at the end for sure. If you are, I think that's it. And I'll go ahead and put up the poll. And like I said, we'll get started here at 10:35. Good morning, everybody. My name is Nathan Darris with the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs, and you're joining us for our webinar on HUD guidance on assistance animals. Today is going to be with me is Jeff Riddle, with the Texas Workforce Commission Civil Rights Division. We did just have a quick poll up that was asking a little bit about the folks who are joining us today. And it looks like about 2/3 almost of the folks joining us today have handled requests for reasonable accommodations for assistance animals. And about 20% of you almost have never encountered an assistance animal in housing. So that's pretty surprising. I'm a little bit surprised at that distribution, but that's cool. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. I do want to put up one more quick little poll. The reason why I want to do this is, and I'll share the results of this a little bit later, is to give you an idea of what, how maybe what you've heard about assistance animals doesn't necessarily comport with what you will actually encounter with assistance animals. So I'm going to put that up here, just give you a minute or two if you don't mind answering that. Okay, so the reason why I wanted to do this was to give you an idea of just about what you're most likely to run into with assistance animals. We've all heard horror stories about, emotional support peacocks and, very strange exotic animals. But, based on what everybody here has actually encountered, more often than not, you're only going to be dealing with cats and dogs. You won't have to worry about the really strange, um, options out there. So I hope that helps settle your nerves a little bit. So before we get started, just a quick little disclaimer here. This material is based upon work supported by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development under the FIP grant number FEOI 1900455. And any opinion, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this material are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Additionally, this webinar does not include any certificates or certifications, and it does not fulfill any continuing education credit requirements. If for some reason you do need proof that you attended this webinar, please wait till the end of the webinar and email me at fair.housing@tdhca.texas.gov. A little bit of housekeeping. All materials and the recordings of this webinar will be available. It says on the TDHCA website, but we've actually moved more towards YouTube. And also everybody who is here will also receive an email in about 24 hours. And that email will have a link to the recording of this video. So you'll get that pretty quickly, even before it shows up on our website. If you have questions, go ahead and put those into the questions chat box after every segment. We'll try to answer the questions there. We may have to hold off until the end of the webinar, but this one we generally have plenty of time for answering questions. And finally, this training is informational only. It does not satisfy requirements in Texas Administrative Code for post-bond closing documentation or for documentation submitted for the 10% test for housing tax credits. Today, I'm Nathan Darris, the Fair Housing Coordinator at the Housing Resource Center at the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. You can contact me at that email address and that phone number. This information will be available also at the end of the webinar. So if you have additional questions at the end, this isn't going to be the last time that you see our contact information. And with me today from the Texas Workforce Commission is Jeff Riddle. Jeff, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Good morning, everybody. As you said, my name is Jeff Riddle. I am with the Civil Rights Division as part of the Texas Workforce Commission. We are that agency that handles complaints across the state, and I get to provide the amazing training. So I am happy to be here today to share some fun factoids about assistance animals.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jeff. So, a little bit of background. As of January 29th, 2020, HUD had estimated that nearly 60% of all Fair Housing Act complaints were regarding denial of reasonable accommodations and disability access. In Texas, from 2013 to 2018, disability related complaints comprised nearly half of all Fair Housing Act complaints. Um, and that all indications were there was an increasing number of these complaints specific to assistance animals. In the state of Texas 2019 analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, TDHCA staff analyzed complaints in Texas and found a similar pattern. Almost 1 in 3 fair housing complaints filed in Texas mentioned denial of reasonable accommodations as one of the issues. So this issue was so confusion about this issue was so widespread that in January of 2020, HUD issued updated guidance on the topic of assistance animals as a reasonable accommodation. That guidance is going to make up the bulk of this webinar, and we split it into 2 major areas, just like HUD did. First, we'll talk about assessing a person's request for an assistance animal, and then we'll talk about how to document the need for an assistance animal if you are someone who needs one and is requesting one. This first part is going to be especially useful for property managers, owners, and residents. And then the second part will definitely be more helpful for tenants and tenant representatives or advocates to help understand the process and what's needed to request a reasonable accommodation. And just a little bit of additional background here for the upcoming 2024 analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. So this is the updated data for assistance animals. Um, you can see that at almost a third of all Texas Workforce Commission's complaints mentioned assistance animals as an issue. Um, and that alone makes up over 300 complaints over that 5-year period. So definitely a significant issue. In Texas specifically, it looks like maybe not so much at local jurisdictions or federally, but in Texas, still something that we need to clear up. It looks like. So, how should a property go about assessing a request for an assistance animal? So, what we're going to do is we're going to start actually with a little bit of a different question. Everybody here has probably heard some story about emotional support peacock, a monkey, aardvark, gerbil. In fact, some of these examples are taken straight out of news stories that we've seen. The peacock, for example, was barred from being allowed on a plane. And if a peacock can't be an emotional support animal on a plane, can it be one in your home? And the answer to this question is, in theory, yes. Any animal can be considered an assistance animal under the Fair Housing Act. And right now, I'm sure at least some of you are thinking, unless you were here for the poll, about what kind of animals you've seen in your requests for reasonable accommodations. Does that mean my property is going to look like the Wild West? And the answer is no. Probably not. And you'll probably be okay, and you won't be overrun by kangaroos and ocelots. We kind of covered this here already, but any animal can be an assistance animal. And we'll cover that a little bit more here in the next few slides. So let's go ahead and move on. You might notice that throughout this webinar, we're going to have a few bolded terms: assistance animal, service animal, and emotional support animal. But we've bolded these words because there's a lot of confusion, and this is generally where that confusion occurs. And people tend to use these terms interchangeably. So we're going to try to clear up the terminology a little bit first. So what is an assistance animal? An assistance animal is any animal that does work, performs tasks, assists, or provides therapeutic emotional support, and is not just a pet. There are 2 basic types of assistance animals. There are service animals, and then other animals that do all those things that we just said. I know it's not really a helpful grouping, but it'll make a little bit more sense as we go along. So let's dig a little bit deeper into that. Might help to see what an assistance animal is not. Most importantly, an assistance animal is not a pet. They should not be treated as a pet by housing providers. This means you can't charge pet fees, pet deposits, or pet rent for an assistance animal. This also means that your breed and size restrictions, such as saying no pit bulls or only dogs under 45 pounds, those don't apply to assistance animals either. This last part is very important. All assistance animals, not all assistance animals, excuse me, not all assistance animals are service animals, but all service animals are assistance animals. So while HUD does spend some time discussing service animals specifically, we found it to be a little bit easier to use the term assistance animal, so there's a little bit less confusion. This diagram is a good way to think about service animals and emotional support animals and how they relate to all assistance animals and all animals in general. So if an animal is an assistance animal, if an animal is a service animal, it's an assistance animal. If it's an emotional support animal, it's an assistance animal. If the animal is an assistance animal, it is not a pet at all. It's not considered a pet. And for the purposes of the Fair Housing Act, it almost makes sense to disregard the terms emotional support and service and focus on the broader category of assistance animals, which covers all of those different types of service animals and emotional support animals. Why the distinction in these terms? Well, that's because there are a couple different laws at work here. The first is the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and this covers public accommodations and only requires that service animals be allowed in public accommodations or in state or local government programs, activities, or services. People often assume that this means that the ADA applies to privately owned apartment complexes or government subsidized or otherwise income restricted apartment complexes, um, simply because they have public or common areas. But that's not necessarily accurate. The Fair Housing Act, though, does cover private apartment complexes and the common or public areas within them. And the Fair Housing Act requires reasonable accommodations be made to allow assistance animals in dwelling units, such as apartment units or any common area that's available to tenants of the apartment complex. So this means that assistance animals, which is the more inclusive, broader definition, must be allowed not just in the apartment unit of the tenant, but in the mailroom, office, common rooms, and so on. So while the ADA may apply to some areas of an apartment complex, the Fair Housing Act applies to nearly all parts of an apartment complex and places greater restrictions on the property as far as what they must allow. Recently, and I'm not sure that I have checked up on this to see what has happened because it's informational only and not very necessary to what we're talking about. But the Air Carriers Act and the guidance surrounding that have been kind of in flux, but don't let that confuse you here. What you hear about happening on airplanes is not going to be useful for determining what is allowed in housing. So you may hear the Air Carriers Act, you may hear about emotional support animals on planes. You can disregard that when it comes to determining how to treat an animal when it comes to housing. So when someone asks to be able to have an assistance animal, they aren't actually asking the property's permission to own the animal. Instead, what they are really asking for are changes to that property's policies regarding pets, including items like pet rent, pet deposits, and breed or weight restrictions. This would fall under the category of a reasonable accommodation. What is a reasonable accommodation? It's a change, alteration, or adjustment to a rule or a policy that are a procedure or service or practice that may be necessary for a person with a disability to use and enjoy a dwelling and its public and common use spaces. It does not have to be written. There are no magic words. A person doesn't need to say the words reasonable accommodations. Generally, if they ask to change a rule and mention that they have a disability or even describe a condition that a reasonable person would recognize as a disability, such as I have trouble seeing or I can't hear well, that is enough to constitute a request for a reasonable accommodation in most cases. At this point, you should jump into the following flowchart here on the screen to help you determine what to do next. The best practice first is to keep uh, a copy of any and all requests that you receive and to keep documentation provided along with or in response to the request. Also, do not share that information with anybody else unless that person that you're sharing it with is necessary to processing that reasonable accommodation request. So we've already used the terms assistance animal and service animal, so let's clarify exactly what those mean. The ADA has a specific definition of a service animal. Most importantly, the service animal can only be a dog, and it must be trained to do work or perform tasks. There is an exception to this definition. The Department of Justice has determined that in very specific circumstances that are unlikely to ever apply to a typical multifamily apartment complex, miniature horses can also be considered a service animal. Additionally, and we will consider this a little bit later and cover it, as a barnyard animal, miniature horses are not considered to be, quote, commonly kept animals. And like I said, we'll cover that a little bit more later. The only reason why, for the purposes of the Fair Housing Act, that you might need to consider whether an assistance animal is a service animal is that there are specific types of questions that are allowed if the animal is a service animal, service dog. This chart takes you through the process step by step, but the simplest way to think of this is in the form of a few easy questions. One, is the animal in question a dog? And two, is the animal obviously performing work or a task for an individual with a disability? If you answer yes to both of those questions, just stop. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Don't ask any more questions. The dog is a service animal, and further inquiries not only not required, but would be inappropriate in most cases. What does readily apparent mean? In the words of Justice Potter Stewart, you know it when you see it. But we do have some examples listed here, such as a dog that's guiding an individual who is blind or has low vision, a dog pulling a wheelchair, a dog providing assistance with stability or balance to an individual with an observable mobility disability. So if you answered yes, it's a dog, but no, it's not obviously performing any work or task for a person with a disability, then at that point in time, you may ask two questions essentially. Is the animal required because of a disability? That's a yes, just a yes or no question. You don't need to know what the disability is. You don't need to know any additional details. And second, what work or task has the animal been trained to perform? If the animal is required because of the disability and the individual identifies at least one action the dog is trained to take, which is helpful to the disability, other than emotional therapeutic emotional support, it is a service dog, and you should just go ahead and grant that a reasonable accommodation then. But if you answered no to any or all of these questions, it doesn't mean that the animal is not another type of assistance animal. It may very well be. Fortunately, the process for determining whether or not to approve an assistance animal is pretty much the same as it is for a service animal. So first, does the requester have a readily apparent impairment or disability? Or did you already know of the requester's disability in the case of, say, an established tenant? Second, does the requester have information that reasonably supports that the service or that the animal performs work or tasks or provides therapeutic emotional support with respect to a disability? If the answer is yes to those, then great. We'll move on to the next step. If the disability is not already known or readily apparent, then did the requester provide information that reasonably supports that the requester has a disability? If yes, and they have information supporting the need for the animal, as discussed already, move on to the next step. If not, then the housing provider is not required to grant the accommodation. But you can't expect that every requester is going to have all of their ducks in a row when they come to you. You do need to give them a reasonable opportunity to provide the necessary information to verify that they have a disability and disability related need. A good rule of thumb here is that if you haven't asked them for the information and given them a chance to bring it to you, then you can't deny the request yet. While it is not required, HUD and TDHCA encourage you to let the requester know about the HUD guidance document, particularly the portion about documenting need, which we will cover later. The guidance document that we're speaking of is available in the handout section or materials section of the GoToWebinar software. So, what kind of information would reasonably establish that the individual has a disability? When in doubt, government documents are always an acceptable source. If a federal, state, or local government provides disability benefits or services to the requester, then that is good enough to establish that a disability exists. But that doesn't mean that it's the only source. Receiving Social Security disability income, Medicare, or supplemental security income while under 65 also counts, as do veterans' disability services or benefits. If the person has a voucher for a housing program or receives housing assistance because of a disability, you can also count it. If a healthcare professional confirms the individual has a disability, that also counts. This does not just mean doctors either. Just because an individual doesn't qualify as having a disability for a benefit or program does not mean they don't have a disability as defined by federal law. Just a quick note, this is a list of conditions or impairments that are often considered to be a disability. This is not an exclusive list. Just because a condition is not listed here does not mean the condition is not considered a disability. Individuals with disabilities that are not observable may sometimes voluntarily provide details about their disability. Sometimes these details will be more than you need as a housing provider to make decisions on accommodation requests. This information, when it is provided and given, should be considered by the housing provider. Also, just because a disability isn't obvious or readily apparent doesn't mean it doesn't exist or isn't real. Diabetes is an excellent example of this. One of the possible side effects of diabetes is called diabetic neuropathy, which is the dulling of sensation in the extremities. And this can make it very difficult or impossible to walk, open jars, or other daily activities. However, it's not necessarily readily apparent when an individual is diabetic or experiences diabetic neuropathy. Even though the disability might not be clear to the provider is not entitled to know the individual's diagnosis, just that the individual has a disability. Here is one of the biggest concerns that TDHCA has heard anecdotally, and Jeff, I imagine TWC has as well, is housing providers that have noticed there are websites that advertise that they can make your dog or cat or weasel a certified emotional support animal for a nominal fee. This documentation alone is not sufficient to establish that the requester has a disability or to establish the disability related need for the animal. Remember, if the disability is not observable, then it is acceptable to request documentation to reasonably indicate the requester has a disability and the disability related need for the animal. Having a certificate that says an animal is an emotional support animal or assistance animal only indicates that the requester spent money on a certificate. It isn't even proof that the animal isn't really an assistance animal. It's just not relevant documentation. The requester may have legitimately thought that assistance animals had to be certified. They don't. This is a very good place to point out. There is no state or federal registry of service dogs, assistance animals, emotional support animals. There's no requirement to register an emotional support animal or service dog. So just having that certificate doesn't mean anything. And you also cannot require, as a housing provider, that someone have one of these certificates that prove that the animal is certified in some way, shape, or form, because such a certification doesn't actually exist on the state or federal level. Just like when determining whether the requester has a disability, a healthcare professional is one of the primary sources for supporting information on the disability related need for an assistance animal. However, if the disability and disability related need are obvious or already known, you don't need to ask for additional information. So, for example, you have a requester who's already come to you previously to ask for grab bars in their shower because they have a hard time getting in and out of the tub due to a disability, and you've already installed them. They come down again in their wheelchair to the leasing office every day. They say hi to you. When they email you a request to allow an assistance dog to help them with mobility, you don't need to ask for any new information. You've already got all the information that you would need to make that determination. The disability is obvious, there's a previously known mobility need, and the request specifically says the dog is to help with mobility. The disability, the need, and the nexus between the assistance animal and the need is established. But what if it is not a dog? What if it's not a cat or a miniature horse? What about the peacock? What about the monkey? There's one easy question you can ask yourself. Is the animal the requester is asking about commonly kept in households? If it is commonly kept in households, then you don't need to ask for more information about the animal or the work or tasks or therapeutic support it provides. Dogs, yes, easy. Cats, normal. Fish, totally normal. Turtles, yeah. Rodents, while personally gross, yes, normal. Even small birds like parakeets and finches. While not expressly mentioned in the guidance, ferrets, which are not rodents, are small domesticated animals that are traditionally kept in the home for pleasure, and this would mean that they would also be considered to be commonly kept. Once you get outside of that group, you start to fall into barnyard or unique animals. So if the requester is asking for a snake, a monkey, a peacock, a Texas horned lizard, or an elephant, then the requester has the substantial burden of demonstrating the disability related need for that specific type of animal. Not only that, they need to demonstrate that the same benefits could not be achieved by a different, commonly kept household animal. If the requester doesn't have that documentation up front, don't deny the request right away. Again, you still need to give them a reasonable opportunity to obtain that information. So don't worry. You will most likely never have an emotional support peacock in your apartment complex. So there are some things to think about here in general. What about dangerous dog breeds? Well, breeds of dogs are not inherently dangerous, but specific dogs might have a history of dangerous behavior that would pose a direct threat to the health and safety of others. Does that mean you can say no to all pit bulls? No, but it does mean that that one Chihuahua that has a history of biting, you can say no to. When a requester submits their reasonable accommodation request for an assistance animal, HUD guidance indicates that you should be able to handle the request or the response within 10 days. In many cases, even 10 days might be too long or not enough time. If the need and the disability are obvious and the animal is a service dog, it should probably not take 10 days. In unique circumstances, it may take a little longer than 10 days. HOA rules are not exempt from reasonable accommodations. This also goes for zoning laws, land use laws, or co-op rules. If your HOA prohibits dogs of a certain breed, that restriction does not apply to assistance animals. Same with local ordinances. A city with a breed restriction also does not apply to assistance animals. If you happen to be in the Austin area, there was a case about 2 or 3 years ago where an individual had a need for two chickens, and a housing provider cited a city ordinance about whether or not chickens could be kept fully outside. Um, this turned out to be almost irrelevant in the case. The housing provider did have to allow the individual to keep the chickens outside in a coop just like they normally would, and they were still considered to be an emotional support animal. A housing provider may not charge for processing or granting a reasonable accommodation. The requester may be responsible for paying for any structural modifications, but there may not be any fee, charge, deposit, or surcharge for the reasonable accommodation itself. Housing providers may, however, charge for damages caused by assistance animals if they usually charge for damage caused by tenants. This can include deductions from security deposits if all tenants already have to put down a deposit. Obviously, if a housing provider only charges pet deposits but no security deposits, which is rare, I don't think I've ever seen that situation, but there would be no deposit for an assistance animal in that case. Housing providers are not responsible for taking care of an assistance animal. That responsibility falls on the individual with a disability. This may mean that friends, family, or service providers may assist, but it does not mean the housing provider has to care for the animal. Even in denying a reasonable accommodation request for any reason, housing providers should try to engage in an interactive process with the requester to try to identify an alternative accommodation that could be made. Housing providers may also not require specific types of evidence or forms to be used when requesting information from a requester, and they should never ask for or require that a requester disclose their diagnosis. The requester may offer that information voluntarily. If they do, that should be considered as information related to the request, and it should never be shared with anybody who is not responsible for making a determination of whether or not to accept or deny a request. So this might be a good place to take a quick minute to look over some of the questions if we've had any submitted. So let's see. Jeff, have we had any come in, or Sean?
No, we have not actually.
Not at the moment.
There must be something in the water because there's almost always questions about assistance animals. Maybe everybody's
Or
waiting
you
until the end.
that, or you're just doing an amazing job.
We'll go with that. All right. So let's go ahead and change directions a little bit here and cover some topics that individuals requesting a reasonable accommodation might want to discuss. So, at the heart of any reasonable accommodation request, there are three major things that you need to establish in order to qualify for a reasonable accommodation. One, you need to have a disability, and you need to be able to demonstrate this to the housing provider. Two, you need to tell the housing provider exactly what accommodation you need. What rule, procedure, or process are you seeking a change or exception to? In the case of an assistance animal, you're usually requesting an exception to the housing provider's pet policy or a no pet policy. And then three, you need to establish that you have a need for the change in policy because of a disability. This is called the disability related need. Just having a disability does not necessarily mean you have a disability related need for what you're asking for. For example, you may have epileptic seizures. The requester, you, asks for an accommodation allowing an emotional support pig. In this case, there's no connection between the disability and the request. There is no disability-related need for the pig. However, there may be a disability-related need for an assistance animal, such as a dog that is trained to get underneath an individual's head during a seizure to protect against brain damage. So always need to be sure that there is a connection between the animal that you're requesting the ability to have and the disability related need that you have. Sometimes these three things are readily apparent. If a requester uses a cane for the blind and requests an accommodation for a dog to help guide them, this individual has already established the existence of a disability, identified the needed accommodation, and connected the accommodation to a disability-related need. So, what should you include in your documentation? I know this page is going to feel like a lot, but it's not too bad if you think about the fact that this page is telling us what HUD recommends. These are best practices. These are not required steps, but these are steps that if you follow them, it will help you get a faster response, and it will make it less likely that your request for an assistance animal is denied incorrectly or mistakenly. So what does HUD recommend? When you are speaking to your healthcare professional or provider, ask them for a letter or a prescription that includes your name, stating that they treat you for a disability. They don't need to say what the disability is and what kind of animal the accommodation will be for. This covers the first two criteria from the last slide, documenting that you have a disability and identifying the accommodation that you need. To cover the third and final criterion, HUD recommends that the healthcare professional's assessment or letter includes the reason why the animal is needed as it relates to the requester's impairment. What kind of work or support or assistance does the animal provide, and how does it alleviate the impairment? You do not have to disclose your diagnosis. However, if you do, a housing provider should never share that or any other information from your request with anybody else, unless that person is needed to evaluate that request. And what if my animal is not commonly kept? What if I really do actually need a peacock or an anteater or a monkey? In this case, you will have to provide a little bit more documentation. HUD recommends that your documentation include the last time that your healthcare professional consulted with you, identify the unique circumstances that justify that need for that particular animal, and if the healthcare professional has reliable information about this specific animal or whether they specifically recommend that animal or type of animal. So this seems like a lot. The next slide should help. If you take this bulleted list with you to your healthcare provider and make sure that they can answer each of these items, that will cover any reasonable accommodation request for any type of assistance animal. Remember, this is your healthcare provider, so let them know what you need so that they can give you the answers you need so you can be in your home with your animal as quickly as possible and with the least amount of difficulty possible. Get your healthcare provider to write a statement with your name and the date they last consulted with you, stating that they are responsible for your care in relation to an impairment that limits at least one or more major life activities, uh, preferably identifying which life activity is impaired, identify what accommodation is needed, what type of animal the accommodation is for, the disability related need for the animal. Does it perform a task, work, or therapeutic emotional support that alleviates a symptom of the or effect of the disability or impairment? And any unique circumstances justifying the need for the particular animal, if it's unique. And any information that explains the healthcare professional has reliable information about this unique animal or that they specifically recommend that unique type of animal for you. Taking this slide into your healthcare provider will help make sure that you get that documentation that you need so that you can get your assistance animal that you need quickly and smoothly. All that said, though, a housing provider might still deny your request for a service or assistance animal. What should you do if that happens? Do not be afraid to be your own advocate. Make sure that you calmly ask why the request was denied. Make sure that you have kept copies or originals of all the documentation that you submit to the housing provider. I always recommend that you submit your request by email or in writing so that you can keep copies and that there's a paper trail. You do not have to submit your requests on a specific form, and the housing provider may not require specific types of evidence. If your documentation meets the requirements set out in the HUD guidance, then let the housing provider know this, and you can even point them to the HUD guidance document or to this webinar. The housing provider may not require you to have your statement notarized or given under penalty of perjury. If they do require either of those things, point them to this webinar or to the HUD guidance. This may still not be enough, and the housing provider might still deny your request. Don't panic. HUD administers a variety of housing programs in the U.S. and can direct or forward your complaint to the agency with jurisdiction. Find out if the housing provider participates in any of TDHCA's programs, such as the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, Home Program, Emergency Solutions Grant Program, Amy Young Barrier Removal, Bootstrap Loan Program, so on. You can always look in TDHCA's Vacancy Clearinghouse to see if they are listed there. If they participate in a TDHCA-administered program, file a complaint with TDHCA. Also file a complaint with the Texas Workforce Commission's Civil Rights Division. TWC is responsible for enforcing the Fair Housing Act in Texas. Jeff, do you want to talk a little bit more about your complaint process?
Yes, if you do need to file a complaint with the Civil Rights Division, the easiest and most efficient manner is to go to our webpage at twc.texas.gov, search the civil rights, which is one of the 13 agent or divisions within the agency, and you'll find our homepage. And on there, you'll find all the information on everything that we do. But you will find a link under our fair housing information to file your complaint immediately right there online. Just make sure you have all the information that you'll need to have. Obviously, you're going to have your information, but also your housing provider's information, the nature of your complaint. Once you submit that, it's usually generally within 3 to 5 business days that one of our intake specialists will reach out to you to get further information and to uh, move your complaint along through our process.
Okay, great. So we're going to give you a chance to write down any of this contact information. I do want to mention that the website listed for the complaints for TDHCA, I have not updated this in the last just couple of months. We've moved over to a new website. Um, I will put that in chat so that that everybody has access to that in just a moment here. But go ahead and take a moment if you need to write any of this down. And we're going to take a minute here to look at questions to see if we have any that came in. I know that we did have some, so give me just a moment to look through them, and so that we can kind of organize our time. Just give me one moment.
Actually, I'm going to add a little bit, Nathan, which would probably answer some of these questions that we've had. Just some food for thought for everybody as well. When we talk about this, documentation, usually is a very big sticking point, specifically more so when we talk about assistance animals than anything else. Some things to think about. If we take the assistance animals out, we think about just a reasonable accommodation. If you were with us last week, if if I have asthma and I've had asthma forever, and I get an inhaler, and an inhaler works pretty good for me, but I also, should have air filters changed and maybe one of those air purifier things. But I live in a place where I can't change my own air filters. So I do get my doctor to write that note, but I mean, my asthma never goes away. That note could be a couple of years old, but my asthma never goes away. So I'm just going to continue carrying that note. I don't need to go pay for a whole nother doctor's visit to go get that note. The same aspect works when we talk about assistance animals, though a lot of times there are a lot of more extra requirements because it's an animal over any other type of reasonable accommodation request we generally see. It's important to note that nowhere did we talk about any kind of HUD guidance or state guidance that set the documentation that needed to be within a time frame and by a geographical limit. I've mentioned this a lot during webinars that I host. One, there is no time frame. The letter doesn't need to be within 6 months of signing or renewing a lease. It doesn't need to be within the last year. If I finally got my mental health provider, because I go through the VA, and if yeah, that might take a little bit to say yes, you need an emotional support animal. And so I finally, after a very long time, get my emotional support animal. And that animal helps me with my mental health. I'm probably not going to keep fighting with the VA to try to get into a therapist appointment. That animal has worked. I'm going to continue to have that animal. So that letter that I got justifying it, which could have been a year or 2 years ago, works. I'm going to be fine with that. I don't need to keep going back to get an updated letter. Additionally, too, people's circumstances can change. And this is all things to consider when we are talking about getting letters. It's not a be all end all. It's just things to think about that also that person may not be able to go back to their therapist. Maybe they don't have current coverage. And if we're asking for an updated letter, that tenant may not feasibly be able to get that letter. And so we're denying a request on something that is still there and valid in a way. It's just not within a certain time frame. A housing provider can absolutely, they can ask for updated letters at renewal and stuff like that, but it shouldn't be made as a requirement. It can be used as an ask. Additionally, and I get this one a lot, I even think there was a little bit ago where Nathan had emailed me some questions about it, where there was a bunch of letters that looked the same, and they were all from different providers, I believe, or different complexes. And another thing to think about when we just think about this in the scope of all that is how many times do we as an individual just reinvent the wheel when we have to make some kind of official documentation? We don't. We're going to use templates. We're going to use word features. We can go onto HUD's website and find an example of a reasonable accommodation letter. So it's important to note that letters could generally look the same, because they only have to meet certain requirements. All of that bullet, if we go back one slide, Nathan, or two slides, I believe, just while, for everybody to think about while I'm talking about it, all of that stuff is good. But again, really a reasonable accommodation letter, Mr. Jeff Riddle has a, mental health disorder. It doesn't have to get into my, actual diagnoses, but, I have a mental health disorder and I need my dog Fluffy as, my emotional support animal for the betterment of my mental health, something along those lines. And that encompasses it states that I meet the Act's definition of a disability. It shows that relationship between my disability and the disability related need, and it spells it out. So when we talk about that documentation, that's really kind of, important thing to think about is the law doesn't talk about geographical areas because telehealth medicine is a thing. And especially when we talk about this, if I know people who have found a therapist and that therapist will move and they will continue to see that therapist no matter where they have moved at, either within the state of Texas or the nation as a whole, because that person works for them. So that it may not be from the same city or county that they are living in. And so when we question those things, again, we can ask the questions, but it shouldn't be made as a requirement that it has to be a local person and within the last 6 months. Um, One of the biggest things that I advise people on, especially when we talk about documentation and more so with the assistance animals than anything else, is you just have to think about it from an old phrase I heard a lot growing up. Is the juice worth the squeeze? And I say that because if you understand what that means, great. You're an old soul like me. If you don't, um, if if I bought a whole bunch of oranges and hand squeeze all of them to make orange juice, it's going to taste so much better than me getting Minute Maid or Sunny D, on the shelf. But it takes a lot more effort to drink that orange juice. If we see a letter and we're not sure about it, you got to just understand, is the juice worth the squeeze? We can deny an accommodation. We can ask for more documentation. Could that lead to a complaint? It absolutely can. And that's something you'll have to figure out. Is this letter, does it meet what we have talked about today? Does it meet the Act's definition? Does it meet the HUD guidance and requirements? And so when we think about that, is it just easier to say, yep, we're going to accept this and not worry about maybe a potential complaint? And if there are damages, of course, obviously, we're going to charge them at the end. We may just not get that money up front. And then another thing before, hopefully I answered a lot of questions, but one other thing I did want to cover too was the dialogue process. When we're talking about, especially when the juice worth the squeeze and everything, and we have that person who brings us a letter, it's important. And I see this in a lot of complaints that come through our division, is that if the housing provider and the tenant actually talk through that process, generally better things will happen. And I say because a lot of times what we see is people talk at one another. This is everything that you were required, and there's no other dialogue. Or here's the only thing I'm providing, and no other dialogue. If we stop talking at one another and talk with, we will generally see more favorable outcomes that could potentially head off a housing provider receiving a complaint or a tenant having to file a complaint. A lot of times our complaints are settled in conciliation, where we bring those people to the table and have them talk with one another instead of at one another. If we can do that before a complaint is filed, then it will save a lot of time and energy on all parties. And I think that and additionally, because it was in the question too, and we didn't cover it, if there is people with multiple animals, then the documentation is going to have to show the need for that. The same with anything else. If I have 3 animals just the same with an exotic breed or something along those lines. If it's one of those exceptional requests, then my documentation still needs to match that those three dogs. If my documentation only states one of those dogs is an emotional support animal, then the other two are pets. Unless, again, that documentation is showing the need for the multiple animals, whether that's two dogs and a cat, a dog, a cat, and a reptile, whatever that may be, that documentation needs to reflect that as well. If not, whatever the documentation reflects is the assistance animal, the rest are going to be seen as pets. Okay, and so Nathan, whatever I didn't cover, I guess we can work through because I see there's a lot more questions coming in.
Yeah, we did get some more questions coming in as you were talking. So one thing that I do want to point out, it came up in a couple of questions, is a question about emergency shelters or homeless shelters. Emergency shelters, for the most part, are not covered by the Fair Housing Act. They are covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act, which means that they generally do not need to accept emotional support animals or other assistance animals except for service dogs. So service dogs are going to be the difference for a shelter. This is we pointed out at the beginning how there were three different laws that cover things that cover housing. Technically, congregate shelter is often not considered to be housing, and that's why it falls not under the Fair Housing Act, which allows emotional support animals, but the Americans with Disabilities Act, which only allows service dogs or miniature horses in those rare occasions. So if you have an ESA and you are trying to get into a shelter, there is most likely very little that that either I or Jeff can do because it doesn't fall under the Fair Housing Act. Um, okay, Jeff, I was not expecting this. This is a new one for me.
Okay.
The question here is, and I'm trying to think of how I would answer this. I think I know. Um, there's a property that has SROs, so single room occupancies, which means it's basically a very small efficiency, no bedroom, so to speak. It's one room, basically. Um, and the individual living there has five support or assistance animals, has documentation for all five. The property believes that the space is too small for that many animals. Are they allowed to say no? We won't. We can only allow up to two. And so I'll give my kind of response here. This would, I would say, touch against one of the places where there's an exception for having to grant a reasonable accommodation. That would be a health and safety uh, consideration. If there is a health and safety consideration either to property or to the health of others, then there may be a reason to deny the full five assistance animals and have a smaller limit. Where you get that limit from, I could not tell you. And I would certainly say you may want to contact an attorney to get a little bit more guidance as to where you would draw that line, because I don't know where you would draw that line.
Yeah. Because just from a straight perspective of what we talked about, I mean, it's checking all the blocks in a typical reasonable accommodation request, and there is everything there. So yeah, then you're getting it. Yeah. I would definitely seek an attorney on that one. Because then there could be city ordinances that we don't know about or county or and objectives or I've lost the word I was looking for, but concerns along those lines.
Yeah, that was what I was thinking too. Okay. Um,
I see one too about current letter was for a poodle, but now there's a new animal. Um, I mean, that comes back to if you know that there's a disability, but there is a need that was previously unknown that you were not, you can get verification of the new disability related need, just not further verification of the disability. Um, Somebody once asked me that they were given a letter for an individual dated like 1985 and the dog for their emotional health. And yes, I mean, I know I said time frames are not a thing, but if that dog from 1985 that was listed on this letter was still alive, um, I really would like to meet that dog. So I would say in that situation, if somebody has a letter and it was talking about their German Shepherd Fluffy, and now they have a poodle called Killer, then yes, they would need to get new documentation because there is a new disability related need in such that they have a new animal. Because a lot of times letters are going to need to have those specifics in there.
Another question was, can you still request current dated shots for assistance animals? The answer is a qualified yes. As a health and safety concern, you can require that all animals, including assistance animals, have current vaccinations or shots that are required by local ordinance. You cannot go above and beyond local ordinance. So let's say you're in the city of Austin. Austin only requires, I don't know, do not quote me on this. I don't know what Austin actually requires. This is just an example. Let's just say Austin only requires current rabies vaccination. You can require assistance animals on your property to have current rabies vaccination, but you couldn't say require them to have current distemper vaccination, because that would be going above and beyond local health and safety code. Um, Jeff, am I missing anything there?
No, I've also been asked to, I mean, so yes, you're going to, and and I think somebody even, and this is kind of perpendicular to what we're talking about, but we're going to follow, current city codes and everything else. So, vaccines, shots like that, leash laws still remain into effect, or being, if there's leash laws, or if your animal just needs to be controlled. Because somebody had asked us, they had an animal, they require leashes in whatever housing. I don't know if it was an apartment complex or what, but for the sake of argument, we'll say that. And the dog wasn't on a leash, but it was able to be controlled. So if that animal is still being able to be controlled, then yes, if there's no like leash laws by a city or county ordinance. So you want to, those are going to be always in effect, and you can't exempt those kind of laws because those are not fair housing things to exempt. Those are city or county ordinances.
Another question came in. Can you have a written agreement with a tenant regarding behavior and upkeep? Um, I will kind of start on this. I think, Jeff, you'll have a little bit more insight into this as well. But in general, a person with an assistance animal is still required to uh, keep up with their animal, so care for the animal, feeding, cleaning up after the inevitable bathroom breaks, and all will still have to pay for any damages done to the unit or property above and beyond normal wear and tear. Um, and if an animal is a nuisance or a health and safety concern, they would still be able to be issued like a lease violation if the animal is loud and can't be stopped from being loud in some way, some reasonable way. Um, Jeff, am I missing anything there?
No, I mean you've covered it. Yeah, I mean, you can deny a reasonable accommodation request if the person or even their animal poses a direct threat. It's very important to understand that a direct threat does mean there is that threat involved, acting aggressive to other tenants or neighbors or such like that. Um, just having a dangerous breed, and I use that with air quotation marks, is not enough to say that that is a direct threat. Um, but all of those, still have to be, but there has to be that threat. It can't be implied um, as a part of who that dog might be, the size of it, the or the breed of it.
Okay, so a follow up on the leash versus voice command, Jeff. So if a person lives on a property, goes to a public place that requires a leash for the animal, but the disabled person says they do not need to use a leash due to using voice command or claiming they are trained and do not need a leash, must they still use a leash? This is going to be super and hyper specific to the situation itself. There are, and right off the top of my head, I cannot think of any examples, but I know they exist. Um, Situations where an animal that is trained to perform a task is actually unable to perform that task if it is on a leash. And so, in cases like that, that individual would most likely not need to have a leash, even if there is a leash law for that specific area. Again, that's going to be very specific to that specific animal and that specific disability related need. It is, in general, under control is the term that is used. An animal needs to be under control of the owner. That usually means a leash, but not always. And I wish I could get more clarity on this to you, but it is not a clear situation, and it is always going to depend on the facts of the specific case. Our city requires animal owners register their pets with the city and provide shot records. Are we okay to ask for this registration info? The registration info, I want to say probably not, but vaccination and shot records, yes, because that's a health and safety issue. Simply registering the animal as existing probably would be something that an assistance animal or service dog would be exempt from. I haven't really seen this in practice. Jeff, have you?
I No, I mean, this is almost kind of coming back to registering an animal, period, in any kind of service. I mean, yes, the city requires that, probably more so for tracking of uh, shots and records and such, which is really the only thing that is needed to make sure that those safety kind of requirements of an animal are met, more than is this dog registered for the city. It sounds like an additional step of ensuring city compliance, which really isn't a fair housing related matter.
Yeah, that's one of those where, yeah, I don't know the. It would depend on the reason for the registration with the city. I think is what it would come down to.
Hmm.
Um, what if the tenant is not keeping their cats inside, which is a requirement at our properties, and keeps collecting more cats and thinks it's okay? So there's a few things going on here. One is that the animal must be under the control of the individual. A cat that is roaming around outside of a unit is not under control. So you can require them to keep the cats in the unit. Um, they also would still need to have documentation that each of the cats is necessary. So they still need to have documentation of the disability related need for each specific cat. So if they're just getting more and more cats, they probably don't have that documentation. You do not have to allow that, most likely. I wouldn't think. Jeff, am I missing something?
No, it's it's absolutely right. I mean, I know that things probably gonna come out well. Like my cat likes to roam, but uh, then I'm sure the time you take your cats there for a purpose, whatever assistance it is providing. So yeah, it definitely still needs to be under control, just the same as whether I had a gerbil that might want to run free, but I mean that's no. I mean if I had chickens, I'm not going to have free range chickens through my neighborhood. I'm going to have them in a coop, no matter what they are.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to point out, that the chickens issue. I'll go a little bit more into the chicken example because I just happened to be in contact with the um, attorney several times who was litigating the case, and so I have a lot of weird insight into chickens somehow. Um, Chickens cannot be kept safely inside a house. And so it's really, really going to be very, very difficult for chickens to ever be allowed at a multifamily property, given the configuration of most multifamily properties. And that has to do with the fact that they are not particularly clean animals, and don't have the ability to hold it. And so they need to have some. They need to be outside. They can come inside every once in a while, but they can't be kept inside, and that's why it's really unlikely you'll ever see a chicken. A tenant did not want to provide the information of their dog to, quote, register it to the property because he said all he had to do was make a verbal request. So he was refusing to complete their paperwork. Is the property in violation, or is the tenant? Okay, a property may not require specific forms to be filled out. If an individual makes a verbal request and the disability related need and the disability itself are readily apparent, then there's not going to be any need to request additional information. With emotional support animals specifically, it is incredibly rare that the disability and disability related need are readily apparent. It is just a function of what emotional support animals do, and that is providing therapeutic emotional support. You can't see someone's therapeutic emotional support needs. You can't see many disabilities that require therapeutic emotional support. So, in the case of an emotional support animal, most likely the property can require the individual to provide documentation, verification of the disability and disability related need for the animal, regardless of whether or not the request is made verbally. Um, so, again, it's going to come down to those specifics, but in general, if we're talking about an emotional support animal, they're probably going to be able to ask for that documentation. Uh, if they have parakeets, how many parakeets can they have in a cage? I have no idea. Um, is unfortunately the answer to that, because right, if you have a huge cage, I imagine you could have several parakeets. I don't know that much about parakeets and the size of their cages, so this is going to be a very specific situation, and you may want to say like, hey, okay, let's talk about the size of the cage that's going to be necessary. This is going to be one of those cases where, as Jeff said, that interactive process is going to solve a lot of problems, and this is like probably one of the best examples that I can think of the interactive process, just talking through the issue as opposed to talking at each other. This is probably going to be the best way to solve that question.
And remember, everything else that comes with a lease or a rental agreement is still going, maintaining and upkeeping the property and, making sure that there's not little surface laid mines everywhere, or that there's not, an abundant smell of urine or feces or something in a unit, all still comes with it. Those kind of things don't get exempted because somebody has a assistance animal instead of it being labeled as a pet. All of those other things are still going to be upheld. Um, and I even think with the parakeets too, if they're having multiple, then if there's again the documentation needs to match the reason for all of them, and so on and so forth. And if that's there, then getting into specifics, of what kind of yard space does a dog might need or a cat, what kind of space does a parakeet need, kind of gets into the semantics of it that we really can't answer.
Uh, so Jeff, this is maybe my favorite question of the day, and that is because this has come up in a TDHCA monitored property, and I don't I don't know that there was a satisfactory answer because the complaint was withdrawn because other aspects of it were solved, and so the rest of the complaint was withdrawn. But this is similar. If a tenant is not able to walk at times to take their animal outside to use the bathroom, and the property has a rule that says pee pads are not allowed to be used indoors, is it okay for the property to still not allow the pee pads for that specific animal, or can the tenant use the pee pads?
I mean, you're really coming down to, again, a reasonable accommodation request is a change exception to a policy, practice, or procedure. So again, a reasonable accommodation request could absolutely be because of the disability and not being able to, take their assistance animal out to use these, is absolutely a request. And again, because I don't think we exactly covered all of them, but when it comes to a reasonable accommodation request, no matter what it is, specifically about talking about animals though, the three ways of denying it is if there is that direct threat, as I said before, if there is not a disability related need for the accommodation. So just because we have a disability doesn't mean we get everything that we want. That there does have to be that correlation between the person's disability and what their need is by what is being potentially impaired. Or if it's a financial and administrative burden to the housing provider. So if it's not meeting one of those three, and again, at reasonable accommodation request is that change or exception to rules, policies. So you have a rule that says no pee pads, but you probably also have a rule, it says no pets, but we have this because it's an assistance animal, so we make that exception. This would just be another one until such time as, again, it might or potentially violate other aspects.
Okay, I believe that our questions have started to taper off here. Jeff, does somebody have a question over there?
No, but a foster dog of my my spouse's likes to talk. Yes, looking for a home. Just saying. And one other thing I also like to mention, because it wasn't asked, but I do mention this one in my presentations. I did a lot too, because I have seen something come up along these lines. Especially with assistance animals. Let's say I'm a housing provider and I go to do my monthly or quarterly inspection of a property. And as I am conducting that inspection, oh, there's an animal. And I did not know this animal was here because it was never mentioned. There's been no pet fees, pet deposits, no talk about this animal. And so, hey, tenant, what are you doing with this animal here? Oh, that's my assistance animal. That is my emotional support animal. Um, okay, so in that situation, a couple of things are going to happen. Number one, that person has an animal in violation of probably a lease agreement. So we are going to issue a lease violation. Concurrently, they have just, because we accept verbal requests, they have just stated their reasonable accommodation request for their assistance animal. So we're going to process that. Okay, you say you have this as an assistance animal. We'll process a lease violation, and we're also now going to process your reasonable accommodation request. Obviously, I did not know you had a disability, probably, or a disability related need for this animal. So, we're going to go through our steps and our process and documentation and everything else that we just discussed. But sometimes that does come up from time to time. It is asked. So I just thought I'd throw that one out there.
Yeah, I think I do want to. There's one thing that I do want to talk about, and this is something that I know that it goes against our very nature as human beings to do. Um, I know because I struggle with this too. We are not um, medical professionals. We're not experts in disability related needs of individuals. So when a property gets a letter that they suspect is fraudulent, I generally will tend to have the response of, okay, do you have reliable information that would make you think that this letter is not genuine? I also would advise against going and searching online to see if you can find identical letters. The reason why is because every letter that you receive, if you treat it the same way and ask the questions that are necessary for determining whether or not a reasonable accommodation is necessary. Is it identifying the specific accommodation? Does it identify a disability, an impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities? And does it identify the disability related need for that accommodation, that change in rule? That is generally sufficient. And I know that as humans, we want to, we want to find out that somebody is, we don't want people to commit fraud, and I get that. But it goes back to what Jeff said earlier: is the juice worth the squeeze? Because generally speaking, the only thing that you're going to be losing out on in a property as a property is pet rent and pet fees, which is generally, that's not a huge portion of your rent, of your income, at least generally speaking, not. So is it worth pressing that individual on a letter that answers the questions that need to be answered as something only you can answer? But as Jeff said, is that juice worth the squeeze? I know that it's hard to not try to figure out if a letter is fake or real, but it's generally not a useful endeavor, at least in what I've seen. Jeff, I don't know if you have anything additional on that.
I mean, I could springboard in one of something to think about when we're thinking about it holistically, because sometimes we get so focused in on certain aspects. And the great thing about this job is I get to look at it a little bit more holistically. Again, going back to a previous example, if I've been having a lot of difficulty breathing, and man, my breath catches, and it's just I'm not quite feeling 100% anymore, or my eyes are getting bad. I make a doctor's appointment. I wait in the waiting room for 30 minutes. I probably go in and, after getting vitals, I'm really sitting down with my doctor for 10, 15 minutes as either he puts me on the breath test machine or starts checking my eyes with the little chart and the sprays and the mist in your eyes. And he's like, yep, you got asthma, or yep, your eyesight's bad. And 30 minutes from start to finish, I'm walking out the door, with whatever documentation I might need in hand. If I'm like, well, and he's like, yeah, start changing out your air filters. These are the things I think you should do. And okay, well, I'm in an apartment. I can't change out my air filters. Well, boom, here's a letter. I've done this 100 times. Here's your letter. And you're in and out. But we think that there's so much more going on to that process for getting that letter than if I have a mental health disorder and I go see a therapist, whether in online or in person, because telehealth's a very big industry now. And after 30 minutes with my provider, hey, their expert opinion. Yep, you need an assistance animal. Here's your letter. There's no major difference between that. But a lot of times we get wrapped up around the semantics of it, or as Nathan mentioned, the potential fraud aspects of it, where we have to have those other things in the back of our mind when we're processing these requests, especially if we want to avoid, you know, complaints or conciliation and time and energy in getting lawyers involved. Sometimes if we can think about those other aspects and again talk with individuals instead of at individuals, we can generally avoid a lot more issues, and a lot more headaches, and troubles than we would otherwise have.
Okay, it looks like we have gone through all of the questions. I have one last little bit of housekeeping. If you need a copy of the slides, I tried to upload them during the presentation while we were answering questions. It did not work. So if you need a copy of the slides, please email me at fair.housing@tdhca.texas.gov. Oh, crap. I forgot a question. Are we allowed to use a third party to verify documentation such as petscreening.com? Jeff, I would love to hear your take on this because this came up and I have not had a chance and I've not figured out exactly where I fall on this. So I'm interested in hearing your take.
So I've heard of a lot of providers who use these. Um, what I can say is, and there might have been some that I just haven't, I don't know about, but generally I don't know a lot of complaints driven from somebody who's using pet scan or pet screening or any one of those, because I do hear of a lot of providers who utilize that to do all the external things. Two things though that I would caveat with that. Number one, if there is some types of fees or involved in that payments, um, to process all of that for something that is external. Remember, we can't offset those fees according to law. Now, if they're completely comfortable with that, then there's obviously no issue. And number two, we don't want to let whatever outside third party agency using, to collect information. That's what they should be doing, collecting information. But ultimately, you as the housing provider are that answer. If something else is providing that answer based on a third party, you're still going to be responsible if there's a denial and there is a complaint, and so on and so forth. It won't be that third party, who is doing screening.
Yeah, that's my concern also lies with the reliance on this like yes no algorithm to kind of be giving answers when a big part of reasonable accommodations, and Jeff and I have mentioned it, is that interactive process. If you're using that screening service to say yes or no, it's not transparent. You don't, as a tenant, necessarily know the reason why it was denied. Um, and I don't even know that as the housing provider, you know why it was denied. You just see, nope, it's denied as an assistance animal. It also doesn't necessarily make accommodations, and I'm using that term more generally. This is not a reasonable accommodation. The software does not make exceptions or have programming that I know of that accounts for local or state ordinances or rules or rules specific to TDHCA monitored properties. And so, I think if you're going to use the pet screening service, be very, very careful and clear about what you're using it for, and why you are, when there is a no given for a reasonable accommodation for an assistance animal, asking pet screening for more information about that and not just relying on a yes no algorithm. And is there any way we can verify the validity of an emotional support animal? No, and I would not. I just would recommend not. You're not a medical professional. I'm not a medical professional. None of us here are medical professionals. Um, the medical professional that provides the documentation stating the need for the assistance animal is the expert on that. And I would rely on that. Um, if you want to go down that road, know that that is opening you up to somebody possibly filing a complaint with TWC. And that's generally not going to go very well for anybody involved. It's not, I mean, as easy as that process of conciliation is, nobody wants to have to go through it. Um, so if the individual with an ESA has documentation that shows the disability related need for the accommodation, I would not try to verify the validity of an animal, if that makes sense. Um, to circle back around, so does this mean that petscreening.com is allowed to be used? Yes.
Yes, I mean, and again, like I said, I've known a lot of housing providers who have used that. Um, and I haven't heard a lot of people like, oh, I don't appreciate that. I mean, there's going to be some. I mean, like I said, you can ask for, can I get a document that, a new letter that's within the last 6 months? You can ask for that, but it shouldn't be the be all end all. If they don't feel like using pet screening, um, then you're going to have to potentially process that reasonable accommodation request without it.
Yeah, I don't know that you can rely on that as the like last line answer, the final answer. It may help you guide your initial answer, but it's not going to be able to tell you, when someone comes back with new documentation or better documentation or different documentation, it's not going to be able to help you necessarily. Um, so I would say use it as a tool to give you information, but still make that determination on a case by case basis each time. So I think that answers all of our questions. Uh, I don't see any new ones coming in. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you to our interpreters today. It's been wonderful to have you all around. And thank everybody for joining us. Jeff, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. And if you all have any other questions, I'll put up our contact information again, and you can reach out to us at any point in time, and we will be able to assist you.
Yes, thank you everybody for joining us today. As Fair Housing Month comes to a close, I hope your May is just as good.
Thank you, everybody.